Hey, I want to thank Max W. for somehow making me realize I'd never said or never properly talked about Robert Brackman, isolated him in the same way I have with Gamble. Obviously, my greatest influence in ultimately, or really the guy who pulled my knowledge, pulled me into, well, set me up, actually, maybe a better way to say it, to a greater unity of painterly knowledge, and introduced me to a better way of thinking, a better way of studying. And so I give Gamble all kinds of credit. I've talked about him a lot, R.H. Ives Gamble. But I think we are overdue, as you ask Max W. I think we're overdue to talk about Brackman, and I particularly want to talk about Brackman because more now that I've dug up his work and everything, because it's been a very long time since I've given him a proper review myself. So thank you for that, Max. Several things I've said about Brackman, uh, you know, not wanting to be or it may have sounded negative, but I'm going to show you some things about him that I moved away from for sure, particularly in a way of drawing. But what I'm really going to talk about is what the value I got from Brackman was. And so here's to Brackman, and the person I studied with first. He introduced me to painting, and there's no question about it. Your first influence, as Gamble says, you never quite get over. Brackman, by the way, was a influence on all sorts of painters. He was only 5 years younger than Gamble. So by the time I got to him, he was already close to 70. I think he was maybe 78 years old already. So what would that have been, right? Something like that, maybe 76. So my two primary teachers were of that age, interestingly enough, over 75. And wonderful to see, as I approach those kinds of numbers myself. Yeah, there's a comfort level with those guys, with the knowledge they had. They didn't seem like they're trying to prove anything. They were just simply sort of laying out the long experience they'd had in a comfortable way. So that's one of the nice things about older teachers. But a couple people that you may know, Brackman had a great influence on, and that is Nelson Shanks. And I'm going to say that based on very little, except watching what Shanks is doing in his work. And then we know that's so of Daniel Green. And you'll be able to see some of those comparisons. But he had influence on all kinds of people. And I kind of wonder whether or not those guys were influenced by the same thing. It certainly looks to me that the same things that made me want to study with Brackman was what made them choose that. But the one thing that Shanks has is this sense of light that reminds me of Brackman. And that was the same thing that I would have to say captivated me. But let me just start with pictures and that sort of thing. But let me read the question first. Max's question, our point was, I was wondering if you've done any videos about your experience learning from Robert Brackman. I've mentioned him quite a few times, but I've never done a whole video. You've mentioned his methods were comparable to the Monet methodology. That's an interesting point because as much as Brackman talked about Monet, and to the very best of my recollection, talked about Hawthorne and Monet, it's more evident that his influences are Cézanne and even Degas. And I'll show you why as we go by in this video. I think probably in the end you'll find that I think that the Boston School is probably more proximal to the ultimate, to the thing that Monet is really up to than Brackman is, and you'll see why. Could you describe the ideas behind this kind of method and how it compares to the Boston School method? Okay, so you're going to just stay tuned because you're really going to see some things that are going to surprise you based on the way I've been talking even about Brackman, which has been very incomplete, as I said, and again, based primarily simply on the things he said to me and the things he extolled in the classroom. Whereas now, when I'm looking at this whole body of his work, you're going to see that I'm going to take a slightly different approach to talking about Brackman. And but nevertheless, let's just look at pictures. Here's my first influence: the picture of the Explorers Club. I knew I was going to do this. I forgot the name of the explorer. But that picture, which struck me, I think I may have seen it through a window at the Explorers Club, and it struck me as being significantly darker than this, but it had a decidedly truthful quality in the head and a terrific sense of light. And that was the thing that above all the other teachers I was able to look at there and get an eye on, that made me think I'm going to hang around with Brackman and see what he's got. And there's Brackman with that cigarette that I want to say I've made famous by talking about him, dangling from his lips there, and in my experience, dashing dashing bits of tobacco into his paint as he stirred it. Brackman was shorter than me, like Gamble, actually, and at least at the time I knew him, and but he was a Ukrainian Russian, and he talked about that to us. Not saying good or bad things or anything like that, but it just became clear to us his background. I think he came to this country as a young man, maybe 8-10-year-old even. Now I'm showing you the picture on the right because, well, by the way, first of all, you should see in that a little bit of the Daniel Green that I mentioned. And by the way, I should say, may he rest in peace. I was his monitor for a year or so, and in his evening class at the Art Students League, and but he was definitely one of those guys who extolled Brackman, really cared for Brackman, and by the way, all of us did. Brackman was a sweetheart. I mean, it's very difficult to think anything else about him. You think of Gamble as much more of a curmudgeon and a few other things. not that he didn't have his excellent. He had a terrific personality, but this is a different thing. I mean, there's something almost boyish about Brackman and pleasing, and he would look you in the eye with a sense of respect and kind of a kindness. You know, very 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 interesting. Guy at his age, and a nice introduction to painting, by the way, just to have a personality like that in front of you instead of a challenging head-banging type. So maybe I better say less while I'm ahead here. But nevertheless, that's the portrait at the Explorers Club in New York. The portrait on the right, actually, I think that's Anne Morrow Lindbergh. And Brackman had portraits, very significant portraits. I'm thinking Jenny, some actresses. I mean, numbers of different people. Had some very good portraits in his career. Yeah, maybe some of those will come up. I think that maybe they won't, but that gets you an idea on the one on the right, by the way, of what his color might have looked like. He was in these types of pictures. He's never wanted to do anything in the background except sort of make it look sort of painty, you know, so it look artistic or something like that. And I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but it's just a pleasant, you know, background that wasn't boringly flat, and yet he wasn't painting the things behind the model. So, and he never discussed that with me, what his rationale was, except classically it might have been just isolate the figure and not be talking about the landscape around, you know, having to do further things with the figures. That seems to be pretty much what his style was like. His approach to painting was what you're seeing here was construction drawing. That's a self-portrait on the left, and it was typical of him to do a pastel, like the pastel head you're seeing there in the middle. That's of the explorer Freuchen. I believe his name was Freuchen, Peter Freuchen. I could be off, but that sounds right. By the way, Gamble did similar things. It wasn't unusual for people to do as a preliminary and a way of hurrying up the process, keeping you from having to have too many sittings to do preliminary studies like this. But Brackman was using construction drawing. So I'll show you better examples of it here. Maybe you can see a little bit on the sleeve of the sitter on the right. Maybe a couple other places you'll see a little bit of that indication of those angles. And when I was working with, let me see if I can point at something for you. But when I was working with Gamble and I drew around, leaving corner points. I don't know if you can see things like this right here. And I would be doing drawing, and he would say, Gamble would look out there and he'd say, I don't see an X out there. Why are you drawing an X? And it was, of course, a challenge to the construction drawing mind, because I was drawing stuff that was, I was putting down stuff that wasn't even out there. And that's an interesting thing, but a serious challenge, one of those things that begins to direct you toward drawing more directly. But this, more like the first time. But this gives you a sense, in all cases here, it gives you a sense that he cared about light. And then you get a sense of his approach to drawing, which was the construction drawing model. I don't know where the construction drawing model comes from, unless I just honestly, maybe somebody could tell me sometime. Maybe somebody could send me that information. But I don't find it in the great drawings through the centuries. I find very little of anything like that. You'll find, not infrequently, long, more broadly expressed lines, not full of details. But the idea of construction drawing, I don't know. I've never been able to find the source for that. And by the way, since giving up on it, I haven't looked that hard either, so I won't pretend otherwise. But I'm showing you one of the things that he did. Gamble was putting together figures Paxton was putting together figures, at least his original studies, in a sense like a Rubens or somebody. You can see he's piecing figures together, and he's doing it rather like Degas. I'm showing you the Degas on the left. This just begins to show you the beginning of his influence, of the things that were clearly influencing him. But the idea of piecing a picture together, and by the way, Daniel Green does this. And I was a sitter for him at one point, in which he was putting a couple of us in a sort of probably a hippie. I was just out of the army, so I was still wearing my fatigue jacket and had long hair, or maybe long hair. I think I'm in one of those books, but I was one of two people, and we were just lined up sort of side by side, as he would do repeatedly. Those are sort of things he was knocking off, and that was very much what Brackman often did. But obviously, he's not quite the draftsman that Degas is, but he's still taking that approach. And again, you can see his love and attention to the idea of light, and of course his sense of form and all that sort of stuff. But again, if you dig deeper, well, this one is actually pretty much the angle stuff is all covered up. So somewhere along the way, I'm going to show you a piece of it where it's not a particularly attractive thing, and you can see what might have turned me off from that. Now, what you're seeing on the left, these are three starts. Two on the right are by Tarbell. The one on the left is by Brackman. So you can see in the one on the left what we would have seen in a demonstration, and that looks like a demonstration on the gray walls of the Art Students League. They were like battleship gray, and we all painted them. And but this looks like exactly what we would have seen. He would have gone around with something like a yellow ochre, and he would have begun to strike in some drawing marks, fairly large pieces, placements of things. I don't remember to what extent he went into the head, but I'm thinking he did in that same way, maybe as he went around the first time even. And so he went round and round with construction drawing. And then he began to chunk on big chunks of solid paint. Not big. His drawing painting probably isn't all that big, but the chunks look pretty good sized for the size of the painting. He typically was doing, as I recall, he was doing them 18 by 24 or so. So this would be a pretty good sized chunk compared to what I personally recall, which, I don't own one, so I don't have anything better to say, but you can see him setting down color notes and then setting other color notes. And he was searching for the movement of color in the same way as an impressionist would do, like all these guys would do. But on the other hand, what you're seeing is an attention by the Boston School guys to something very different, right? Where the drawing is pretty much limited to the strong players, and the color is more broadly expressed. It may be broken color, but it's not put down in patchwork like that. So in that way, you're seeing something that you would probably say that's probably more like Monet. But that preliminary drawing where there's a carefulness to sort of articulate everything in front of you. Too bad we don't have the ability to just put two side by side. But this is a start by Tarbell. So you can see that there's a greater attention to the breadth of the big color, and then color movements within that as a primary thing. But they still would have been typically, as you'll see outdoors in some of the studies I've shown you already by Tarbell, that he's also using broken color in trees and things like that. One of the things that turned me off about this kind of thing in my own work was that it wound up looking all textural. So here in the Boston School, you'll see that that respect for the texture of the surface is there from the very beginning. But yeah, I'm comparing those things. It doesn't mean anything beyond that. There are many people who've approached it either way, in both ways. This one on the right here, you can actually see Tarbell doing that, what I just talked about. You can see this broken color, but on the other hand, this is textured grass. Even this stuff, but you can see it's following very much the same model as the Brackman, just putting down color notes. And building up and building up and building up. He would be early on really attending to the drawing, but he wouldn't have done it through construction marks. There's nothing I've ever seen that suggests that he would have done that. You can see that down through here, there's nothing careful about drawing. It's really just largely found. I'm looking for anything. Well, there are a few lines in there. It does look like there's some lines in there, so let's not go too far here. It's so difficult to tell that, but and I don't want to make my method their method either. It's very tempting to do that, but mine, I don't do any preliminary line, as you've seen in my video, the GBA time-lapse video. But now this is giving you that model of what Brackman's doing. This is a Brackman in which you can see him painting 1, 2, 3 objects. And the background is just what? I don't know. But it's a similar approach as Degas, who's drawing objects. There's a figure object, a bathing tub object, et cetera, and cloth objects. These are drawn individually, right? Well, the reason for this is because this is imaginative painting. You would take parts, you'd take parts and piece together a picture, and you'd find your unity the way all imaginative painters do. What I would argue is via the plausible. You would look plausibly true. With Gamel, when he was putting those pictures together, he would put up his models. He'd have a setting, then he'd be able to put up his model and his objects and all these things one at a time if he wanted to, or have the second model come in and just stand in the right place in relation to where the other one would have been, and then copy them. And he'd have exactly the same light and all that sort of thing, and sort of have a sort of a plausible. And these guys would all do the same thing, undoubtedly, be drawing from the same location in relation to the light and so on. But I just want to mention this because the influence of Degas is significant. In fact, it was heavy, rather, on Brackman, and the idea of piecing together a picture like that was a thing. And we didn't learn anything otherwise. What you're seeing here isn't that model. This is a field of color relations, and in that way, it's much more like Monet. Except I'm going to show you something different. Let me go back. Let me go. Oh, I'm going too far ahead. All right, let me just stick with this because I'll jump to this. But there's a Monet later that you all will have seen, the Japonese, that has the same feeling as the Brackman, Tarbell. The Brackman, I mean, and Degas. That it looks like it's pieced out of all the parts are sort of stuck on and made to look like it's plausibly doing that. Now these I take as being these are outdoor pictures. This is an outdoor study made from the imagination again. He clearly didn't have models out there and was not copying the general impression of the effect of the general effect of the day as the Benson over here and the Tarbell here are doing. This is at the Hood, by the way, the Dartmouth College. If you haven't seen that, it's a delightful little thing. But you can see what these guys are doing is they're handling this field all at once, the whole field, and not painting piecemeal. I mean, you will definitely wind up painting piecemeal. And my guess is that the sitters all went out there the same day, one day. And he painted them in that day and then possibly had one or two of them come out again on other days when he had the unity of that general impression going. It looks like it never quite got all pulled together, but you can see that the orientation is to get the blue here right to the greens, to the yellows, to the pinks, to all that stuff as one field of truth on its own. And in that way, this is a Monet, where this one over here is actually a Degas, right? It may be Monet in the broken color in the building of the back or the parts or even the grass or whatever, but it's not Monet in the sense of being everything set up and you walk in and there's your impression. And you just find the most logical way to proceed, and you're all over the place at once, Boston School-wise and all that stuff. You're not doing that. So in that way, these are imaginative paintings. Both of these paintings would have been done by that means. She would have stood out there, and he would have hit notes as she stood there. whatever degree of pre-scribbled drawing he might have had. And I can't even begin to answer that question. By the way, that's one of those things where if you see these paintings in person, you might stick your head in there and really have a nice look at it. So now here's another example of a field of kids. And was it the same thing? Is that a baseball bat there? No, presumably they're going boating or something. So that's a Tarbell, I believe, that's a Benson, I think, on the left. And so again, the Brackman on the right. But again, it's a piecemeal picture. It's pieced together out of all these characters. And he seems to be trying to create an allegory or something like that, which again is one of the things that Gamble was frequently doing. Is this an allegory of life in some way? Is this you see older people, you see young people, you see sadness, you see children. I don't know. It's funny to have the same character carrying a staff in the middle, or a hoe in that case, but interesting. But you can see that the occupation of Brackman was only Monet to the degree of using broken color on an object. You see what I mean? It wasn't the search for broken color through a field and the interrelations of this to the note to this note to this note to this note to this to this to this to this. All these things going round and round. What are the darks doing to each other? And so on. You see, it's a different model, even though both of them respect light. There's no question that Brackman gets this delight out of light that he introduced me to, as I've told you before in other videos, and as you'll see in his still lifes coming up, he had a love of light. So again, I'm going to give you the Monet in the middle and the Monet on the right. This does appear to be doing what Brackman's doing. There's a sort of a lack of cohesion of the field here, which he would never do when he's painting out here. So I don't know what that was, and I get the impression from things I've read that he was not happy with this picture. So I honestly don't know what he was thinking. I've seen critiques of this picture which are just completely off the mark. I think this is a very pleasing picture, but it's not the Monet we think of when we see, mostly it's this. And you can see that the model, this is now a painting by Benson. And this Benson is painted a figure indoors, just like this, but it's painted like Monet, more than this Monet is painted like Monet. That's one of those places where you are much more attuned to the lost and found, to where the drawing isn't needed. It tends to come up after the fact. In the case of Monet, the drawing just simply comes later. Benson seems to be operating much more like I do, and that is that he's drawing at parts all the time. He's drawing at significantly leading parts and building the drawing over time. And that is to say, building the drawing of the painting over time, whatever marks he may have made in a preliminary way, which I still have never, I don't have any knowledge of. Maybe I should have, but I've never seen anything that indicates he did an underpainting. I would be surprised if he didn't, actually, so don't misread me on that one. You could argue that it's my own perverseness that makes me want to paint without underpaintings. But I wanted to show you these two pictures in the bottom here. These are Hawthorne's. Now, when you read books about Brackman, he credits Robert Henry for sure. He talks about Robert Henry as being a big influence, and then John Sloane. And I don't see either one of those guys actually much in Brackman's work, but I also don't see Hawthorne in Brackman's work. And by the way, that's in the very nature of your problem as a painter, is to figure out what it is that makes you want to even be here, in terms of the visual world. And you're going to have to find your own way. And the world now that we've gotten 500 years past the Renaissance is just full of possible different ways of different methods, different mindsets, each of which are in their own search for, or best in that ride to find, to bring forth that which excites you and or inspires you in the visual sense. So the Hawthorne down below you can see is considerably more like Monet, and he did work with Monet as I understand it. And by the way, Brackman talked about all three of these guys, and yet I can't find any. Nothing I've read so far has given me the evidence that he worked with Hawthorne. I think he did. Even Gamble was hanging out with Hawthorne, and I should have looked up the date of his death, but my guess is also that Brackman also did. But you can see that the way of working is all over the place at once. It's not early detail. This is more like Robert Henry, by the way. But it's the big color relations, and this really, you can see this. There's this feels like the same world, more so than this, and certainly more so than Brackman when you look at that one on the right, right? So now the other influence, the other guy he liked to talk about, Brackman, was he seemed to have this just a love that he actually odd. It's always struck me as odd how much Gammel also enjoyed Cézanne. And yet, if you want to take a good look at Cézanne, read Christine Herder's book called Defensive Art, which has a lot of considerations and quotes, number of quotes of Cézanne talking about what he was doing and the way he was ultimately more interpreted than he, was interpreted into who we think of him as today than he is that. But what's interesting is these two are Brackmans on the right, and in only a very subtle sense is there a difference between these. You'd be hard pressed to say there's a difference between these two pictures. You'd be hard pressed to say one of them wasn't the other, it didn't belong to the other guy. The ones up here, this has a little more sense of lost and found, painting the unity of shadow and that sort of thing. But each of them has this way of being painted, as it were, one object at a time, very differently from that model that I've been talking about, the Boston School model, and that is what we're focusing on, just making a comparison between the two. I would like to say that there's nothing I'm more pleased about than, and I have to assume it's Brackman's own influence. And I know particular moments when that happened where this idea of bringing the light was brought forth to us. And, once you saw the light, you were turned on. There was something about it that you'd never want to paint another picture again if it didn't have some wonderful light qualities in it, So, and as I said before, you'll see it in Shanks and some other guys that we know studied with Brackman, or at least they give credit to Brackman. So here's the same two paintings on the right, and the one on the left is a Tarbell. You can make your own judgments about what the differences are between these worlds. But again, the one on the right feels considerably more piecemeal. The Brackmans feel more piecemeal. The one on the left, that whole thing about, limiting your drawing to what's really essential, as say what's dominating and slowly creeping up on the weak players, as opposed to drawing objects one at a time through a picture. And of course, there is no use of construction drawing in any significant way in the Tarbell, whereas that would have been fairly characteristic of these, and I don't see any place where I could point it out to you particularly. And again, then there's three nudes. And this is one where you can really see the piecemeal thing. These apples are almost trompe. They're coming up over the model or sticking in our eyes, and that's the sort of thing that piecemeal painting, you've got to really be careful and thoughtful about painting interrelatedly. If you drew the model there and you decided to add some fruit, you might do well to put the model there with the fruit and find those interrelationships so that this doesn't happen. But these appear to be floating in space and sitting out in front of the sitter. And so that's one of the characteristics of the piecemeal, one of the hazards of piecemeal painting. Those of you who want to can say that he was simply using license and that sort of thing. That was a big deal in those days. Not that I know that he ever said anything to me about using license, but again, you can see that the cohesion of the Boston School figures here is far greater. There seemed to be an emphasis on unity of the general impression right from the beginning, and we know that was the case. Whereas the piecemeal guy, as I said, he's much more of an imaginative painter, and you're inevitably sort of stuck with painting pieces and bits as you create a picture out of whole cloth, so to speak. And there again, you're seeing very much the same thing. And the top one in the middle is Brackman, and the one on the right, and the lower one too. And the one on the right is a Tarbell with a table. I was putting these out there because a table in still life. It's the same one we just looked at by Benson on the left. But there again, you will see the sense that this is done by one piece at a time. The whole thing feels like it's done one piece at a time. And I'm guessing it was, where this guy, you could, even if you did work one piece at a time and it was all set up, it would tend to look more like this picture here, which is another one of those things that makes me believe that it was, he had a model, he drew the model for a while, and then some other day he set up a still life. It's not necessarily that way. On the other hand, his interest is in painting from the objects and not from the grand abstraction. This is much more of a Velázquez approach. What you see, that great shift that Velázquez makes. Brackman seems to not have acquired that, and we think of it as atmospheric and all that sort of thing. Well, there's a sense of atmosphere in parts of this, and you can see that's because he's adhering to the lost and found model more greatly in that foreground part. But this doesn't seem to have much, if any, of that sense. So yeah. So in both these cases, you're seeing this organization around the unity of the general abstraction, and they move away from the idea of the integrity of the object, right? And again, as I said before, in that Degas model, drawing is what happens between the contours. If you think that way and you're just putting one, that would mean object painting, wouldn't it? And then you're just putting one after the other. That's why I say the best way to describe this is you're an imaginative painter, and you are painting it. Even if you have a setup here, you're painting it as if you were an imaginative painter. You're painting one piece at a time. But it has that feeling. It doesn't hang together in terms of space, in terms of the general impression as a Boston School painting does. And this, by the way, this one on the left, I think it's as nice a piece as I know of by Brackman. And I share this Paxton on the right. And I think Paxton was my perception of Paxton is he didn't by any means define the Boston School, but he was a student. He was not 7 or 8, whatever years younger than Benson and Tarbell, who really are the sort of the core. And of course, DeCamp along with them, they seem to have a unity of their sense of things. Where Brackman's is clearly much more oriented around getting each object, so to speak, right. Interesting, he's put his own painting in the background in the top there. That's fun to see. But you can make of it what you will. When Paxton goes outdoors, you'll see him painting brick walls like this with counting all the little bricks in the wall. But still, this hangs together really nicely. It's a very effective piece, and as strong as anything I've seen in terms of that impressionist unity. And yet it still has that sensation of each object being painted sort of that way, one at a time. And you still get a sense of that from Paxton as well. So that's where I'd say these guys are more similar. To the degree that that Brackman is piecing things together, this is a really nice job of unity. But it does have a feeling of being attacked one little piece at a time in a curious way, and not being seen in a great big way. I wouldn't tell you that's why that I walked away from Brackman in that scene down there, though. This and some of the other work, I really did it because I wanted to complete the problem of how to draw, and I was seeing great drawings out there, just even coming out of the art students league back in the teens, thinking McMonnies, for example, and so I was moving toward Gamel because of his conversation, Twilight of Painting, and because of his. And by the way, in that course of that time, I ran into the Boston School, and the difference between the painting I was seeing around in New York at the time and what the Boston School was doing was I thought I was dealing with something that would elevate my abilities more so. But this is a delightful piece on the left by Brackman. Again, there's just a little bit greater orientation around each object and that sort of thing. You'll see Paxton is the nearest thing in the Boston School to doing that. On the other hand, there's a different sense, atmospheric sense, in the one on the right, but that's the thing it's hard to judge when you're dealing with such different objects. I think that's the end of what I have to offer you today. So my hat goes off. My thanks to Brackman. He didn't say one word to me that was pernicious. He loved light. He respected truth in drawing, and he presented things in a way that, with all humility, just had a fantastic personality and nature to him. There's a brilliant way of getting started as a painter. So I thank him, and I'm sure that Daniel Green and Shanks or whoever else have been influenced by him over time would say the same things about him, and maybe even some things I never even thought to say. I'm going to go up to the start of this and look at the question again and see if I've left anything out. If anything comes to mind, I was wondering if you've done any videos about your learning from Broadway. You mentioned the methods were comparable to the Monet methodology. Could you describe the ideas behind this kind of method and how it compares to the Boston School? I think I've done that, but I want to show you one picture if it's still on here. I hope I haven't lost it. There was one picture that shows the sort of the construction drawing thing. I think I took it out. Oh, that's a shame. Yeah, it was one of the nude combinations, and it showed construction drawing, and as grotesque as it can look at times. The feet down here have a little bit of that feeling, but then you'd say, look at Degas. Degas creates a unified form rather than he doesn't ever show that he's sort of hacking at it with angular marks. But yeah, but sorry about that. I did mean to show you that so you can see how clumsy and awkward it looks. And it did look like that to us when he was making marks in front of us. We didn't know any better. I experimented with that. It was what was being taught in the drawing rooms. You know, the only conversation down there was big diagonal. You know, may as well just call it the Barg method, sort of, whatever you could do in 10 minutes in the Barg method. Just hack out some, if that Barg method even means that, by the way, that's another question. But that's where I'm talking how differently guys like I mean, these guys are drawing the long line, like Tarbell, they're drawing the long line when they get around here, and doesn't look hacked at or attacked by the angles. Again, that goes back to that thinking of Ang that they did more approximate, in painting from the round. And so did Degas, by the way. Degas' lines are long and continuous. They're not. It's not sort of searching with little chunks of angles. But that's the one thing I would say that I chose to move away from with regard to Brackman. But I do think this one on the left here does give you probably the best idea of what we saw him demonstrate, and that's that proximity. That's as near proximity as what you'll see to at least the thinking that you perceive surrounding the Monet thing, and then the broken color and the red, yellow, blue thing, or getting every spot to be the right color, the right color, the right value in the right place, that sort of thing. That's very much in evidence here. Kind of amusing to me to see that gray wall. There are students like slick, slimy, actually looking gray walls. Anyway, all right, I'm going to stop at that. Thanks for the question, Max. I hope I'm being fair in every way. Mostly this is about my takeaways from these guys, and you wanted a comparison. Comparisons are always sort of odious. There are any number of things by Brackman I still admire, but you can see my orientation is much more around a more encompassing thing, more fluid drawing, and more all over the place at once impressionism. So that's just the evolution you're looking at sort of right in front of you here, my personal evolution. Even though I never saw these starts when I started studying with Gamble and those started getting introduced to the Boston School, these weren't very well impressed on me. I'd seen a couple shots, photographs, and I'm thinking they were black and white, by the way. But the drawing really did impress me over and above what I saw in New York, so that was what happened there. All right, well, that was the 70s. All right, good. My hat's off to Brackman. I thank him in this final moment for introducing me to painting, and with a brush in his hand, and I don't have any regrets. It's stuff I still use now. All you gotta do is remember it's just this to this and that to that. It's a relational game, right? And the music's in the relationships. And then to say, don't you see the light? Look at that, somebody's finally painted some light. And as he's pointing at a painting with me, I guess, the Brackman, that's huge stuff. And neither one of them were lost on me. Those are the building blocks of solid painting. So thank you, Mr. Brackman. And others picked up on the same thing and used it in their own way. Really got benefit from Brackman. He was a great value, great personality in painting, and yeah, great. All right, next time I'll thank you all for your contributions. Thank you all for your donations, subscriptions. Keep it coming. Keep sharing if you don't mind, and keep the comments coming in. And we'll see you next week.